Ted Gunderson was an FBI agent from 1951 to 1979 when he retired, and he contributed heavily to the moral panic of satanic ritual abuse and what we know as a satanic panic today. He was on Geraldo many times and other daytime talk show hosts, and always they put him forward as this voice of authority because he had the credibility of having been in the FBI. And for many years, there seemed to be no conspiracy theory he didn't solidly believe in and advocate for, but it never seemed to diminish his credibility. He was always coming on the shows, on the scene, in the media, as strictly a man who was special agent in charge for many years in the FBI, and that gave him the weight of authority to speak on issues from 9/11 truth. He said also the 93 World Trade Center bombing was an inside job, the Oklahoma City bombing, Pearl Harbor, of course, and he was an advocate for the chemtrail theory, which is one of the dumber conspiracy theories you'll ever come across, that the contrails from jet airliners are full of toxins and poisons meant to either kill us or render us stupid or in whatever way contribute to the advancing of the New World Order. During the Obama administration, he claimed that there were thousands of death camps being set up and some certain quantity of guillotines were collected along with caskets, and he knew their locations in Georgia and Montana. He always had this kind of information that he was just about to release, and he was always saying that it was supported by his various contacts within the intelligence community and by his criminological research, being an expert, having spent so many years within the FBI. But of course, they never manifested. He caused an uproar in 1989 when he was on the Geraldo show and said that in Mason County, Washington, there was a mass burial site where they can't possibly go there and dig them all out, he said, because there's just too many of them. It was a satanic burial ground. He was claiming that the police weren't following up on this, and he was trying to get this information out there, whereas, as a matter of fact, the police actually began looking for him after he was making these claims on live TV because they wanted to know what he was talking about. They wanted to know if there was any credibility to his claims. And after a while, Gunderson made comment about this, and he said he wouldn't turn it over. He quote, "If I turn this over to the wrong law enforcement officials, I could blow the whole thing," he told a reporter. "This element has infiltrated every level of society. It's big, it involves heavy-duty intelligent people, doctors, lawyers, prosecutors, police, airline pilots. Every walk of life has been infiltrated." What's interesting is you think he's just a paranoid rather than a con man, but you see elements of being a con man as well. In fact, at one of these points when he was on the run away from law enforcement looking to speak to him, or claiming that he was laying low because the FBI was going to murder him for knowing too much about their ties to Satanism, it turned out he was actually on the run from the FBI, it seemed, because they were looking to question him about a fraudulent loan system he had set up where people would give him front money, and he was supposed to give them back. It was called Decla International. He was never brought up on charges for that, but they did want to question him, and it seems like in that time frame he was really avoiding them for that. Here's a kind of introductory video that gives you kind of a flavor of the kind of appearances Ted Gunderson made, the kinds of claims he would make as well.
In my opinion, I can't prove it, these are mind-controlled victims, MKUltra mind-controlled victims, and the whole thing is designed to destroy the Second Amendment, to take our guns away from us.
And I said to myself, what's this all about? I don't know anything about Satanism. I read about it in the Bible, of course, and that's about it.
The sacrificial ritual, a deep incision beginning at the sternum area of the chest, is made with a long blade sacrificial dagger.
So, of course, this was obviously a satanic ceremony.
Most important thing is that we have a mission to save our own souls and save the souls of all of us around us. So,
establishes there is a conspiracy and infiltration into the lower levels of the government all the way to the White House.
Other parts of the victims are worn as worn as charms or saved to be used in spell casting.
The final goal was to take over the world, the one world government.
Where the immortal who serves the head of another immortal gathers and takes in that immortal's life force, energizing him, much like in the series of The Highlander.
So in checking into the Jack Kennedy assassination, I learned, no question about it, that it was a joint hit by the CIA and the Chicago mobs.
This evil element has infiltrated virtually every level of society.
I finally figured out when my blood pressure, they were giving me some kind of a gas that raised my blood pressure, and I tell this publicly because they're probably going to do it to a lot of us.
And I say that there's close to 4 million, if not 4 million, practicing Satanists in America today. That's 1.5% of the population.
The cut is then brought downward to the belly button, and a vertical incision is made across the abdomen, intersecting the first cut, forming an upside-down cross.
Because I met with Osama bin Laden in the spring of 1986.
By the way, this dovetails, the satanic cult movement dovetails into, as part of the Illuminati, dovetails into drugs, prostitution, homosexuality, the whole 9 yards.
Turn your old car in for cash, okay? Because they don't have the computer in the old cars. They want everybody to buy a new car so that they keep track of us.
McVeigh was mind control. No question about it. The children are disappearing in this country at the rate of 83 per hour. That's over 700,000 children a year.
The World Trade Center 93, and that 911 is actually a ploy in order to take away many of our constitutional rights and civil liberties.
In some cases, some of the internal organs and parts of the victim's body are consumed by the group, as it is believed that immersed sexual powers, strength, and psychic powers can be ordained through this process.
It's been planned 2 centuries.
In the desert in Area 51.
But the bottom line is another step toward taking over the United States and taking over the world. The Illuminati plan, the golden plan.
Well, we're talking about a police state.
There's thousands of Americans out there. By the way, I've been shot with a laser beam twice. There's been attempts to gas me.
I have been told by a source that's reliable, a source that's involved in the intelligence community, that there is an extensive city underground in the Las Vegas, Nevada area.
It is a conspiracy.
This was obviously a satanic ceremony.
We all need to leave the country to save our lives. We're getting ready for martial law. Everything's pointing to martial law.
That is iced tea from last night. That's what I spilled in my lecture. Okay.
Chanting, candles, coming out with a movie. People think it's fiction, it's not true, and yet 5, 10, 8, 15 years later, whatever it might be, it comes to pass. And so it makes me think, hey, do you think people in Hollywood know what's going on ahead of time? Well, I think we do, most of us here. He was mind control, no question about it, in my opinion. I can't prove it, but he was.
A former son of darkness, now a child of the true light, Jesus Christ.
This is all on the internet, by the way.
So he had about 30 years after he quit the FBI and went into private practice to disclose the information he claimed he had. He kept claiming he had some 300 boxes of information and that they were trying to kill him. This Illuminati ploy, they were putting poison into his air ducts at his home. They were infiltrating his car. They were sneaking in at night, but they would never come outright and kill him until he died of cancer at the age of 83, 30 years later, and you'll still see people on the internet saying they finally caught up with Ted. They took him out. But his credibility never seemed to diminish no matter what he did. He also claimed that the government was suppressing a cure to Down syndrome that he knew about and had tested himself. But he wasn't on Anderson Cooper one time. Anderson Cooper was talking about Sylvia Browne, this discredited site.
James, you've actually called Sylvia Browne a villain. We spoke to Ted Gunderson, who's a retired senior special agent in charge of the FBI in Los Angeles. He's worked with Sylvia, and he says he's worked with her quite a bit, and he says this about her. He says, quote, "I've worked with numerous psychics in the past, and very few are really on target, but Sylvia Browne is probably one of the most accurate psychics in the country." Now, that's from a former senior FBI official. Are you saying he's wrong?
Could he possibly be wrong? I first became aware of Ted Gunderson, I think it was about 2004, and I was researching this old defunct cult from the 60s known as the Process Church of the Final Judgment. And I had been talking to some of the people who were part of the process, and I read a book by a man named Maury Terry that tried tying the process to the Son of Sam murders, saying that these were ritualistic murders at the behest of the process and done in the name of Satan, of course. And the evidence provided in this book wasn't very good at all, despite the fact that Maury Terry was supposed to be a journalist. He didn't quite tie it all together, and it didn't much make sense in the least, and it was terribly unconvincing. But I saw that in the credits of the book, he thanked Ted Gunderson, the great FBI agent who helped him out. And I thought it seemed very bizarre that somebody with that kind of credibility would have helped on such a shitty book. So I looked up Ted Gunderson, and I don't remember how I found his number. I guess it was just online, where he wrote affidavits all the time and had his number on them. But I just called him up, and I asked him what he thought, where was the real evidence that the process was involved in the Son of Sam murders? Was there more to it than what was in the book? And he said he had gone, I think, with the author or with some other investigator to one of the crime scenes, or to one of the rooms of one of the people who was a perpetrator, some significant location in the case, in any case, and that there was a Bible open to some passage in Isaiah, and it had a typical kind of depraved biblical quote in there about bloodletting or whatever else. And he cited the quote, and I said, "But Ted, it's the Bible, it's the Holy Bible." And he said, "But that's what these Satanists do. They leave little clues like that everywhere." So I guess if you're looking for the clues, you'll find it wherever you go. And I also asked him what he thought about the process. Several of the luminaries from the process went off to open the largest no-kill animal shelter in the world, and they were stridently anti-vivisection and pro-animal rights. And he said in regards to them opening the animal shelter that this is because they need the animals to commit their ritual sacrifices. And I asked him what direct evidence he had of that. And he was a little frustrated and said, "But that's what they do. That's what Satanists do." And Ted just knew it, and that was the evidence he needed. Of course, there was all kinds of evidence in these boxes that never came forward, in all kinds of credible sources that needed to remain anonymous. So by the time Ted Gunderson died, I was suspicious that perhaps he wasn't actually in the FBI at all, or maybe he was in the FBI, but he was just a clerk, and he was kind of riding that wave of credibility ever since and never really did anything with them. So when he died in 2011, I requested his personnel file from the FBI, his full file, and they sent it to me, and to my horror, I saw that he was indeed very much a high-ranking FBI official. He was a special agent in charge in Knoxville, New York, Albuquerque, New Haven, Philadelphia, Memphis, Dallas, and Los Angeles. Until he retired in 1979. He actually came into his position. He didn't have any background in criminology. In fact, he was a mediocre student in business administration, some school in Nebraska, and he got his job by virtue of writing a letter to the Bureau back in that time that just said, "Gentlemen, I am under the basic requirement of being 25 years of age, but most people consider me to be 26 or 27. If a person has the outward appearance of being 25 and can fulfill the many other requirements, why shouldn't he be considered for a position? If at all possible, I'd like to be considered as an applicant. Yours very truly, Ted L. Gunderson." And it worked. He had a job just before that selling hams, which for Hormel, which he never put down. He said, he reminisced about this in 1975 in an interview. He said, "Selling hams was all right, but I love this job," about the FBI. Later on in his career, he became very much a public advocate for the FBI while he was still in the FBI, and he did a lot of media appearances. And he spoke when there was backlash against the FBI during the civil rights movements and that type of thing. He spoke very much in favor of everything the FBI did. He said, when we had the counterintelligence effort called COINTELPRO going in the 50s and 60s, these methods helped break the backs of the people dropping bombs everywhere and wrecking millions of dollars worth of property. Extreme tactics were needed if we were going to stop them. If the FBI had not taken an aggressive approach in the early 60s when revolutionaries had taken over the college campuses, the loss of life and property would have been greater than it was. Amid the uproar against the FBI in regards to revelations of how they monitored Dr. Martin Luther King, including placing a bug in his hotel room to try to catch him doing dastardly deeds and blackmailing him, Gunderson explained that here too the FBI was in the right. And he said one of King's top advisors had been identified as a communist. And given Gunderson's history of placing people as Satanists thereafter, you wonder about the credibility of a lot of his FBI work. Responding to criticisms leveled against the Los Angeles FBI while under his personal command for its alleged harassment and unconcealed surveillance of a visiting Chinese scholar from UCLA, Gunderson told reporters, "You just have to take our word for it. If it's our investigation, it's a legitimate surveillance." It's really funny how he was advocating for police powers at the time he was in the FBI to come out and have this extreme paranoia against the FBI. It seemed like that paranoia was partially of his own making. You can see some of the paranoia in these media reports too, because he was also quoted saying that there's an element that wants to overthrow the government and has always been present, but the Vietnam War gave this element a cause. It added that, he added that the element still exists today. In fact, it was an appearance he did, or a letter he wrote to one of the papers where he was publicly complaining about restrictions from the Attorney General's office against increased police powers of surveillance and preemptive activity on the behalf of the FBI, that the director at the time, Judge William H. Webster, asked Gunderson to cool down and that they could work within the Attorney General's guidelines. And Gunderson wrote this impassioned letter where he was saying, individual rights are of the utmost importance in a free society, but what are the rights of victims? Los Angeles at present is in a frustrating position, respectively request any suggestion. There's danger here, but our hands are tied. He was saying they really needed to be able to bug people, I guess, without warrants. They needed all kinds of increased latitude. Webster disagreed. He said, we can work within the guidelines set forward by the Attorney General, and there's no need to change that at this time. So like a week and a half later, Gunderson put in for his retirement. So it seemed that it was based on this reticence on behalf of Webster to increase the powers of the FBI or fight against the Attorney General for more police powers, that Gunderson decided to leave and go into private practice. And that was 79, and right away he goes into a high-profile case, the Jeffrey McDonald murders at Fort Bragg. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but it was a very, very popular case at the time, still very contentious. This book, Fatal Vision, and film was based on it. But Jeffrey McDonald was a medical doctor at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And on February 17th, 1970, the police at the military base got an emergency call. They thought they were responding to a domestic disturbance. They came in, McDonald's wife and 2 daughters were murdered. He had a stab wound and a concussion. He said he was attacked by a gang of hippies, 4 men, I think, and 1 woman who was supposedly holding a candle and chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." And a lot of his story just didn't add up. When they were looking at the evidence, the material evidence in the house, there weren't significant signs of struggle in the living room where he said this combat had taken place. In fact, they couldn't find any of his pajama fibers in there, but they found pajama fibers of his under one of his murdered daughter's fingernails. Pigs was written on one of the headboards, but apparently the finger used a glove, a medical glove, the type that Jeffrey McDonald used in his practice and I think had in his home. And when they were looking at the story he was saying of this Manson-like cult, they felt it matched very closely to an article he had clearly read in Esquire magazine that was sitting in his home that it described the Manson murders. And in reconstructing the murders, they speculated that he had gotten in an argument with his wife and she had hit him on the head with a brush and giving him the concussion, and that afterwards, after he had murdered his whole family, he stabbed himself with a scalpel. There's still a lot of people who feel that he's innocent, and I think Errol Morris takes that position in his most recent book. The more I read about it, the more I don't know why people think he's innocent, but I don't feel like I've read enough to make a strong case one way or another. But what I do think is clear is that Gunderson coming on the case 10 years later after the murders in 1980 didn't help anybody arrive at the truth. That is, there was a woman questioned shortly after the murders who was thought to perhaps fit the description of the woman who McDonald had said was chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," a drug user who lived close to Fort Bragg by the name of Helena Stokely. Gunderson decided that she was a great prospect and that she must have been the killer, and he set about immediately trying to coerce a confession out of her. And in fact, he hired a Canadian psychic to go and tell her that she was in love with McDonald and that they would, ultimately get married or some damn thing like that and run off and have a happy life if she would just get him exonerated. And another ex-FBI agent who was working on the case accused Gunderson of coercing her with promises of books and movie deals and that type of thing. Still to this day, people are trying to get Jeffrey McDonald out of prison. He wasn't convicted until 79 or 80, thrown into prison. But it's still a very popular case, and you can look up the details anywhere. There's endless articles about it. And that's Helena Stokely at around the time they brought her in for questioning at the time of the murders. Now, Gunderson felt like he had one piece of real ironclad evidence in the Helena Stokely case, and this was the fact, he claimed, that she had said in an interview that there was a hobby horse, or whatever, the horse the kids ride or whatever, and it had a broken spring within the home. And he said at the time she said this, that nobody else would have known it but the family. And he says this in a lecture in this clip, but you'll notice a distinct difference in what he's saying to Helena Stokely in an earlier interview.
So the first thing we did was try to contact Helena, because she had made these admissions but never had made any statements per se. And we talked to her on the telephone through her brother in January, would have been in January 1980, which is when I entered the case, right? And Helena was not cooperative, told us to drop dead in so many words. Her husband, Ernie Davis, also said, leave her alone. But in talking to her on the phone, I said, Helena, look, I have inside information that you were there. Now, to be honest with you, I didn't have that information. But it's a little trick that we play, right? But it works. I planted a seed. There's no question about it. It's a technique I've used for years. But she still would not cooperate. Another witness I developed was a woman in Dunkin' Donuts. Helena told us that she was a member of a satanic group. It was her initiation into the group that night. She was the one that was yelling, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." She talked to us about when they entered the house, there was a German Shepherd that barked as they left but didn't bark when they entered. She told us about a rocking horse in the child's bedroom. The spring is broken. She couldn't ride it. She wouldn't have known that if she hadn't been in there that night. A big issue in the case is fact that you said that the hobby horse was broken. The prosecution claims that you saw a picture in the newspaper several days after, and therefore you knew it from looking at the newspaper. But actually, the only people who knew that were the McDonald's themselves. Did you see this picture in the newspaper?
I never knew anything about the hobby horse again until 1979.
No, you knew that night that the spring was
the
broken.
night of the murders, yes, but it was never mentioned again until 1979 at the trial in Raleigh.
Did you see the picture in the newspaper?
I never saw any pictures. You had to realize I was strung out on heroin, and that can be proven anywhere. Vanderbilt University, I instigated the methadone program there with Dr. Richard Treadway. It can all be proven that I was definitely on at least $200 a day of heroin.
But you did not ever see that picture?
How many junkies go around reading Newsweek and things like that?
So even though later on he was claiming there was no way she could have known, earlier on there's this confession here that there were pictures of the hobby horse already published, but she's saying she was too high to notice them. But it gets even worse. In 2007, CBS acquired photographs from the crime scene, and they found that none of the springs actually were broken. So there you go. Anyways, Stokely would go from confessing to recanting, and at one time she named 5 male co-conspirators, and none of them could be tied to the location. Some of them had solid alibis. One of them had a real ironclad alibi. He was in jail on the night of the murders. So her confession was rightly deemed absolutely worthless. There's another bit of clips from this interview I put together, because this is Gunderson interviewing Helena Stokely in 1982, and I think the clip kind of gives you an idea of just how scripted it seems to me her answers were, and it gives you kind of an idea of Ted Gunderson's tactic overall.
And then in October and December of 1980, you gave Mr. Beasley and me a statement wherein you advised that you were definitely there. Now, since then, last summer, as recently as last summer, the FBI contacted you, and you said you don't recall being there. Can you tell us why you changed your mind through these last 12 years so many times?
Yes, sir, because at the time of the murders, I was involved with the Satanic cult. Since then, I've been contacted. I'm now pregnant. Anyone who knows anything about witchcraft knows the firstborn child can be sacrificed and will be.
You told Mr. Beasley and me also in 1980 that one of the high priorities in human sacrifice was a pregnant woman for this group. Is that true?
Yes, sir. The firstborn child is very eminent in any type of case like that.
When you say eminent, what do you mean?
It's considered, well, it's the top of the list.
To that, after the murders, and during the murders themselves, you were actually a member of this cult of 13 people.
Yes, sir.
Will you name the people who were also in that cult with
No,
you?
sir.
And why won't you do that?
I can't do it. So.
Did you personally believe in the philosophies of this cult?
No. At the time, and still at this time, I'm a practicing Roman Catholic. But I wanted to get involved in white witchcraft for benevolent purposes. Sir, I feel that Captain Jeffrey McDonald should be freed once and for all, and not to have to go through all of what he's been going through for the last several years. I have not been coerced. I haven't been promised anything, except for the fact that I was promised relocation and change of name and all that kind of thing, which I don't want.
You're talking about promises from us. You have not been promised anything by us.
Right. No monetary promises, nothing like that.
In other words, what you're saying is...
It's basically just a conscience.
And we are going to attempt to talk to top federal and state officials in hopes of obtaining immunity for you
with the understanding from you that you, in turn, will furnish us not only more details or other details that you may be withholding, but also the names of the people involved and the members of your cult and other information.
I've tried to come forward before, and every time I have, I've been made to look like some idiot, some incompetent fool that doesn't know what's going on, that was so high on drugs. It's been proven otherwise, because I have been under hypnosis. When I went under hypnosis, the doctor that administered the hypnosis said that I had a mental block at 1:30, and he said that he felt that was self-blocking.
Deliberately, in other words.
Yes, because I knew what was going on. I used LSD a lot. At the time, acid was the name for LSD. I chanted, acid is groovy, kill the pigs, hit him again, or something like that. I said, acid is groovy, kill the pigs, hit him again.
The most interesting part about that to me was that she said that they were using hypnosis, and it sounds like they were using hypnosis to recover memories. I don't know what she means when she said that the hypnotist found that there was a block at 1:30, and I don't know what 1:30 means. Maybe the time of night. I know the call came in sometime in the early a.m. That the murders had taken place. But of course, Ted Gunderson from this case would work very much with people who claim to be survivors of ritual abuse who were recovering their memories thereafter. He also, sometime just after the McDonald case, claims that he came across the conspiracist Bible that he would work with thereafter and sell at many of his conferences. It was called Pawns in the Game by a Canadian author named William Guy Carr. And it's has a very anti-Semitic slant to it. It uses the protocols of the Elders of Zion to build this story about the Illuminati conspiracy that seeks to take over the world, really kind of outlining the same points from the discredited protocols of the Elders of Zion. And even though Ted Gunderson would speak a lot about the police state coming up and comparing it to Nazi Germany, he didn't seem to have he didn't seem to be entirely turned off by Nazism, to the point that in 2006 he went to a Free Press Barnes Review conference, which is a very far-right Holocaust denialist kind of group, to give a lecture. And also at that event they were throwing some kind of party for a former SS officer who was there. Must have been very old at the time, but the pamphlet that wrote this up that I had found later on was gushing that about the courageous opening of the museum, quote, dedicated to the memory of Adolf Hitler. It was indeed one of the highlights of the conference, meeting this courageous patriot, meaning the SS officer, who continues to fight the good fight well into his 80s. God bless you, Herr Juncker. So yeah, that was something Ted Gunderson was at. And I feel, kind of tangentially, that when you get a guy like Ted Gunderson and you get people like Alex Jones and you get people going down this rabbit hole of conspiracy theory, the anti-Semitism, if it's not pre-existing, is going to come later on. I attended many conferences for conspiracy theorists, whether it's in the UFO fringe or the ritual abuse fringe. And I guess somebody of my hair and general makeup doesn't cast suspicions in that regard. And I was seeing that I could whittle it down to one word to get the words flowing. I could just lean in and say, Jews, and people would let fly with theories about world banking and other types of corrupt Zionist takeover. And I feel that makes sense in the conspiracy fringe if they're looking at the history of their beliefs and they look backwards to about the time of the French Revolution, where some of these Illuminati conspiracy theories came into prominence almost fully coherent as we see them now, and those kinds of suspicions of a Jewish threat that were prevalent. As for the hypnosis being used to secure evidence of blocked memories, 1980, this book, Michelle Remembers, came out, which coincided nicely with Ted Gunderson going into his private practice and searching for Satanists. But Michelle Remembers, discredited, of course, now, even on the mundane details, journalists looked into the background that was presented in this story and found none of it really true. And it's amazing that anybody had to do this, because it's a supernatural horror story as it is. But it became a bestseller, and she was taken as a credible witness on talk shows and that type of thing, where they were telling this story of this woman who went under hypnosis by her therapist, Lawrence Pastor, a Catholic, a psychiatrist also in Canada, who began revealing these stories of satanic ritual abuse, and not just satanic ritual abuse in the real world, but she was supposedly visited by otherworldly beings, including the Archangel Michael and Jesus Christ and Satan himself. And Jesus, I guess, comes and removes her physical scars from her, taking away some of the corroborating evidence for her story, conveniently. But it's bizarre to see that these types of things would be treated in the news, and this is where the media was really complicit. They would talk about the threat of satanic ritual abuse, and when presented with stories like this, they would often fail to mention the supernatural aspects and pretend that these things exist in the real world. And you'd see Geraldo talking about those things, saying, well, whether you believe in Satan or not, whether you believe in these kind of supernatural premises, there are people who do, and these are the things that they do. And these are what we've learned from people who've recovered their memories. The same as people who've recovered their memories of alien abduction, past life regression. And I found that there's actually a significant scene for future life progression. Look it up online. I'm sure you can find a therapist for it to this day. And I'm sure you can go to conferences for any one of these things and get continuing education units as well. Ted Gunderson began traveling around with alleged victims of mind control, most of whom had recovered their memories in one way or another. And one of the most significant of those that he was traveling around with was Bryce Taylor. And she had a rather absurd series of claims about her position within the government as a mind-controlled sex slave. And you can see, again, the kind of media complicity where, as outrageous as this story might seem, the story that Bryce Taylor was actually telling was far more outrageous than this. And I think there's this false sense of balance that the journalists think they need to strike, where they need to try to give this, they feel like they need to try to give this story its best chance possible to make it seem credible. But when that means denying certain things people are saying, I feel like it's simply irresponsible.
Now to a spy thriller unfolding in the heart of suburban Los Angeles. The CIA allegedly brainwashes a woman and turns her into a sex slave to the rich and famous.
It does sound bizarre. Jody Baskerville is here there with this Unit 13 exclusive investigation.
Bryce Taylor used to be your typical soccer mom, with a successful husband, 3 kids, and a beautiful home in the San Fernando Valley. That is, until she started telling of a secret double life as a mind-controlled sex slave for the CIA.
I would have sex with him and deliver whatever messages that I was programmed to deliver.
Now, this one-time suburban housewife finds herself the unlikely leading lady in a real-life psychosexual spy thriller, co-starring a former Los Angeles FBI chief.
Bryce Taylor is absolutely telling the truth. I would stake my name and reputation of 50 years on it.
If Bryce Taylor's story sounds more like a movie than reality, well, maybe that's because it's awful close to the plot of Long Kiss Goodnight. Just like Gina Davis, Bryce is knocked unconscious in a near-fatal car accident that jolts loose suppressed memories of another life as a CIA operative, seducing the rich, the famous, and the powerful from Washington to Hollywood.
I happen to have 2,200 plus pages of documentation of the mind control program.
Bryce alleges that she and her entire family were among the victims of that program.
Drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, torture,
And Bryce says it turned her into a mindless Stepford wife. A programmed sex toy who could be triggered into action by the CIA with subliminal messages embedded in her brain.
I was a human robot. I had no idea because I was programmed to consciously only know that I was, doing my motherly housewife duties.
Whether it's true or not, Bryce's story has had a tragic effect on her once happy family. She and her husband are now divorced, and her 2 grown sons have virtually disowned her.
Well, my ex-husband and my sons think that I'm absolutely crazy.
Kelly was the only one who believed her mother's story and suffered a complete nervous breakdown over it.
Kelly actually made 2 suicide attempts.
And now at age 22, Kelly is in a catatonic state in a California mental hospital after being committed by a judge just last year. However, Dr. Hartman suspects Bryce is not a victim of CIA mind control, but of a strange condition known as false memory syndrome, in which delusions are unwittingly reinforced and sometimes even implanted by psychotherapists themselves.
Many of the cases in recent years that have caused problems have been the result of psychotherapists. They didn't really understand the power of the techniques and the way techniques can make things go wrong.
We contacted 3 Los Angeles psychotherapists who treated Bryce, but all of them refused to discuss her case even with her permission. Pam Monday believes that's because they've already been threatened by the CIA.
There is no such thing as false memory syndrome. There's nothing in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that says there is such a thing.
In fact, Dr. Monday claims the condition was actually concocted by the CIA to cover up its mind control experiments. Bryce Taylor wrote about her alleged life as a CIA sex slave in vivid detail in a new book out called Thanks for the Memory.
See, there was reference to this idea of false memory syndrome. It wasn't explained very well by the psychologist acting as the counterpoint. And then you see this asshole Pamela Monday talking about, well, there's no such thing, therefore Bryce Taylor's claims are entirely true. The idea is that when you're going through hypnosis and the therapist is asking you to recall memories of abuse or things like that because they're sure that they're repressed and they're there, people begin to kind of fantasize these things. They go through this hypnotic regression and they believe they're retrieving memories, and they begin cultivating those memories, and they become deeply held beliefs, and they very much react like real memories in people's minds. And this was studied at Harvard, where they were looking at people who claimed to be abducted by aliens, and they retrieved their memories of alien abduction through that similar type of hypnosis. And they did a test where they were measuring their response, their trauma response to these script-driven narratives about alien abduction. And they were seeing that the trauma that these people were suffering related to these memories of being abducted by aliens acted like real trauma. So when you weigh this on somebody, when you give them this kind of narrative and you cultivate that, that is very much a real type of abuse, and you're really crippling that person thereafter. And you can see that in the Bryce Taylor story. In some of what she talks about how much therapy she went through, how much time she spent trying to recover her memories, and how this crippled her and made her almost invalid at certain points in her life. And you also see her daughter, Kelly, catatonic in a mental hospital as an inpatient. So the news report references Bryce Taylor's book, Thanks for the Memories, which should indicate that they should have had some idea of what's in the book. And I think reading the book itself would kind of show it's so over the top, it's not even worthy of being discredited by investigation. One of my favorite segments talks about the dolphin porn that she was filmed in, directed by Sylvester Stallone. And she said, another auxiliary project, one that brought in proceeds, was dolphin pornography. Dolphin porn was filmed in Malibu, and there are the dolphin tanks at Point Mugu. It was convenient because they had cages already built, and so the dolphins could be housed there for use almost any time. Ronald Reagan really loved the dolphin stuff. He watched a porn video of my daughter Kelly and I with a couple dolphins. During the viewing, he smiled, patted my leg, and said, "I'll be with you later." He wasn't into sex with children, didn't have sex with my daughter. When the film was over, he said, "Watching you do underwater ballet is beautiful, but seeing you with the dolphin is out of this world." He laughed and looked up like he was seeing a missile or shuttle launch. Lots of dolphin porn was filmed. I believe Bob Hope gave copies of it to Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and Margaret Thatcher, who is a lesbian. Now, here were some other Bryce Taylor claims, and I'll have you know, you can find her full book of Things from the Memories online. And these aren't outlier claims. These aren't things I had highlighted from reading the whole book. This was just me perusing through and finding wild shit she said and throwing it in because I thought you would appreciate it. She has a little segment there about Barbra Streisand. Barbra Streisand is a mind-controlled robot whom Bryce would have sex with one-on-one in order to deliver a message to her and keep her programming going or to instruct her on what to say at certain times. Because I guess there's no way to tell somebody something without having sex with them. I don't know. The Queen of England used Bryce for genetic engineering, breeding her with Ronald Reagan, producing a child for breeding within the royal family. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Henry Kissinger, Nelson Rockefeller, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bob Hope, Elvis, almost every notable has had a crack at Bryce Taylor at one point or another. Henry Kissinger used her as his personal secretary / human computer for 19 years because of her photographic memory and the computer skills they kind of installed into her brain, though nobody can corroborate her having ever been with Henry Kissinger at any time. Jesus personally appeared to her and said, "Get up off your knees and leave. You, my child, are innocent. You've done nothing wrong." The Illuminati ruled over Elvis and would send Bryce to service him and instruct him on what to say or do during his next performance. The idea that Elvis was hard up for a piece of ass after his shows, I don't get that. Quote, "When my mother left my father to babysit me, he withheld all food from me until I was starving. Then he held my bottle in front of me, but instead of allowing me to have the bottle, he'd slip his penis into my mouth for me to suck." And this was supposed to, now, that's not funny, but the idea that this was supposed to enforce mind control on an infant that's still suckling on a nipple is insane. The idea that this would be traumatic to somebody at that age who has no context for it whatsoever, and that this would serve to traumatize somebody and reinforce multiple personality disorder, which is the claim, makes no sense from a cognitive perspective. She says, "I started menstruating at 10. This heralded abuse and rituals which involved being raped and impregnated sometimes twice a year." Now, this doesn't really make sense from a medical perspective that none of this could be corroborated also. I mean, it seems ridiculous I'm talking about corroborating her story at all, but if you look her up, Google her up when you go home, most of what you'll see are people saying, well, you have to check out this woman's amazing story about what's really going on behind the scenes in the government. There's a great piece on dangerousminds.net, which is associated with disinformation.com, which has published many books, and they were putting out a series back in around 2000, I think it was, for Discovery Channel, and they had a pilot season that you can get on DVD and can probably download somewhere. It was hosted by a guy named Richard Metzger, who wrote a piece about a piece they did about Bryce Taylor and Ted Gunderson, where he was reminiscing. And it was interesting because I hadn't brought it up when I previously wrote about Gunderson, but people were telling me that when Gunderson was going around with these mind-controlled sex slaves, he himself was clearly trying to bang them himself. And this was kind of hearsay, but Richard Metzger in his piece, which is pretty funny, says, "It was obvious, and I mean obvious, that Ted thought he was going to get laid." And this was when he had gotten both Ted Gunderson and Bryce together for the piece. "He followed Bryce around like a male dog sniffing around a female dog's ass. When I wanted them both on camera at the same time, she balked and took me aside to admonish me not to make it look like we're a couple. She wasn't into him, but she wanted him there on camera to make her seem more credible or something." And he went on to say, "Over the years, when I've been invited to screen the disinformation TV shows at museums and repertory cinemas, the most ridiculous question anyone has ever asked me about this piece, and it gets asked nearly every time, is how much of what she says do you think is true? How about none of it?" And that's another bizarre thing in the conspiracy fringe. It seems the more idiotic evidence they can pile on, the more people tend to think, well, there must be a shred of truth in this somewhere. Where there's smoke, there's fire. But I think oftentimes there really isn't anything at all. Here's a great kind of clip on, that came from Geraldo, where Ted Gunderson was talking and says the most ludicrous thing about why he never comes forward with his sources and never bothers to make an arrest against this conspiracy that he claims to have had such personal interactions with.
Respected law enforcement professional, recently or retired now from the FBI, former regional director of Los Angeles. Do you, sir, believe that these dreadful allegations of babies being sacrificed are true?
I absolutely believe it, without any doubt. Based on the information that's been given to me across the country by numerous survivors and by confidential sources and informants.
Then why don't you name these people and arrest them? Never a name, never an arrest. These women come out of a group and they insist that they know the people in the group, and yet they do not identify these large mysterious cults. Name them and arrest them and get them off the street.
Does he not make a valid point?
He makes a valid point. The problem with that is, number one, police officers don't believe it. I may believe it. You may believe it. Some people in your audience may believe it. They don't believe it. Number two, if you decide to investigate these people, you have to, number one, handle it from an undercover operation. If you put an undercover operation into effect, then you have, in a sense, your own police officers become involved in these heinous crimes, and they are, of course, become murderers. And in addition to that, if you do decide to investigate these people, there's a lot of work. And many law enforcement officers are apathetic and don't want to get involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard this. The debate here could rage over this issue alone for hours and hours and hours. Michael Aquino is right when he says there have not been any successful prosecutions for this horrible allegation. Ted Gunderson is a sincere man with a good reputation who says that there are difficulties in the prosecution. Still, the point is it has never been proven in a court of law. Obviously, it needs more investigation, but if these things are happening, then there should be a national task force of federal and state and local cops working together to prove or disprove. Because this is just unacceptable, this impasse. Coming up, we're going to have warning signs you should watch for, parents, and all of our guests will be available for a final discussion about Satanism after this break.
But I just love the ludicrous answer that they can't name them and arrest them because undercover officers are themselves becoming murderers and just acting as recruits for the satanic movement. At what point do you pull the cover off of the undercover operation when you're running around apparently ritually sacrificing babies and all the rest? He started sending bizarre letters to characters like John McCain and Ronald Reagan, and those letters ended up being forwarded to the Attorney General. And honestly, in looking through the FBI file, I'm surprised at how much follow-up they did. At one time, Ted Gunderson was claiming he had received some kind of poison in the mail, and they actually went the extra mile, even knowing who he was and how many claims he had made of people trying to kill him and the Illuminati out to get him. They ran full analysis and everything else. John McCain actually sent this to Attorney General. They researched the claims Gunderson was making and came back and said, you know, we're actually only getting generalities here, and despite this man's claims that he has this kind of ironclad evidence, he never coughs it up at all. But intermittently, Gunderson would try to hand these things into authority, apparently not realizing what actual evidence is, which is also, you know, bizarre considering his full employment in the FBI. And it was a fairly spotless record he had in the FBI. There were a few reprimands, but nothing major. But he would often send these gushing, pathetically groveling letters to whoever was the director at the time. And he loved J. Edgar Hoover. And to his dying day, he seemed to never say a bad word about Hoover, and was very adamant that Hoover was not a homosexual. Because I think Ted Gunderson firmly believed that the homosexual agenda was also part of the satanic movement. He would file these lawsuits as well. He was suing, saying his phone is tapped. He's always filing these affidavits, making these claims about gang stalking, the Illuminati, or whatever else. And you can still find these things online, and usually you'll find these online posted by people who feel that that documentation in and of itself proves these things. And that's kind of common in the conspiracist fringe. Once you bring something to the courts, once you file affidavits, you've made it real somehow. One thing that I feel still really seriously needs to be debunked is the McMartin preschool scandal. A lot of people don't feel that this, most reasonable people don't feel that this is credible today, but it really kind of helped kick off the satanic panic. What happened was there was a woman dropped off her 2.5-year-old child, pre-verbal, meaning this kid couldn't talk, at the McMartin preschool before she had even enrolled him there. She just kind of left him out there. She was a paranoid schizophrenic, and she was a paranoid schizophrenic before the McMartin thing happened. There's kind of this revisionist history now about McMartin that it was the stress of the doubters and unbelievers that caused her to go crazy and caused her ultimately to die of alcoholism and cirrhosis of the liver. But that's just not true. She had severe mental problems well before this happened. She dropped her kid off at the preschool. They took pity on the kid, took him in, and enrolled him, even though she hadn't enrolled him herself. Or in 1983, her name was Judy Johnson. She is inspecting her kid's anus for some reason. And this seems a little odd because it's generally reported that the kid was of poor hygiene overall, so this kind of scrutiny seems a bit much. And she claimed to notice some kind of abnormality or rash or whatever, and she claimed that her estranged husband had molested the boy, and then she also claimed that he was molested at McMartin preschool. The whole panic was kind of kicked off when the police department sent out this asinine letter to all the parents, not meant to kick off a panic at all, but it says in part, records indicate that your child has been or is currently a student at the preschool. We're asking your assistance in this continuing investigation. Please question your child to see if he or she has been a witness to any crime or if he or she has been a victim. Our investigation indicates that possible criminal acts include oral sex, fondling of genitals, buttock or chest area, and sodomy, possibly committed under the pretense of taking the child's temperature. Also, photos may have been taken of children without their clothing. Any information from your child regarding ever having observed Ray Bucky, who was a guy who worked there, to leave a classroom alone with a child during any nap period, or if they have ever observed Ray Bucky tie up a child, it's important. And they asked them not to panic and also tell them not to share this information with other people, and they sent it out to 200 parents. Well, naturally, the parents go crazy, and they take their kids mostly to a place, the Children's Institute International. So, and Children's Institute International is working on these kind of pseudoscientific premises, so there's a kind of perfect storm of stupidity working here. And during this time where there's this panic of possible molestation at the preschool, the author of Michelle Remembers, the co-author of Michelle Remembers, Lawrence Pazder, comes to speak to the parents about the crimes of satanic ritual abuse and what to look for and that type of thing. So you have all the makings of a moral panic, and then Ted Gunderson comes in too. So all the shit hits the fan. So they start interviewing the children, and at Children's Institute International, they also start examining the children, and this is where the medical evidence comes from. Independent medical examinations of the children showed no signs of abuse. At Children's Institute International, they were working on this idea that it was theirs to confirm the stories they were claiming to get in the interviews with the children. So if they could find any abnormality in any examination, any rash, redness, any fissures on the rectum, whatever, that's evidence that abuse could have happened, and that's the kind of testimony they gave, and that's the entirety of the medical evidence. There was a day, in fact, in the courtroom where it goes down in infamy, where they spent the day looking at huge blown-up pictures of the kids' anuses in the courtroom, and the doctor trying to point out abnormalities that he thought could have indicated abuse. Now, it's a funny story, because I was out with, I was meeting up with John Waters one time, and the director, and I hadn't realized that he had attended the McMartin trial, and he was telling me that a terrible thing happened. The New York Times was doing a profile on him and wanted to see what's like a day in the life of John Waters. And he said, well, I'm going to go to the McMartin trial, and they went. And I said, let me guess, that was asshole day. And he said, yeah, that was asshole day. And I had to tell them I had no idea this was going to happen. I really didn't. You know, he's very uncomfortable with the fact that he brought the New York Times with him one day, and it just happened to be the day they were showing kids' rectums on the screen. There were tunnels at McMartin, and you can see, because this comes into play later on, Ted Gunderson claimed to find tunnels underground in McMartin, but it seems if kids were talking about tunnels at McMartin, there were these colorful boxes that were built by one of the people who ran the McMartin preschool, and they would make these tunnels that the kids could go through. They would usually put them in this kind of horseshoe formation, and they could crawl about through the boxes. So those are the real tunnels of McMartin. During the interrogations of the children, they would talk about all kinds of things, and there wasn't much making sense of it. They claimed to have encountered turtles, rabbits, lions, a giraffe, a sexually abusive elephant, flying carpets, dead and burned babies, dead bodies in mortuaries and graveyards, goat men, flying witches, space mutants, and local politicians. And how much of that was from the coercion and the interview tactics is hard to say. It seems like a mixture of both. I mean, there were things like wooden giraffes and that type of thing within McMartin that the preschoolers would play with, and then these get distorted into tales of ritual sacrifice of giraffes and horses and other types of animals, and it turns into this lurid tale of these things taking place in a series of underground tunnels underneath McMartin, which simply weren't there. The DA sent investigators, and they found there were not tunnels under McMartin, and the prosecution even sent their own investigators, and they said, yeah, there really isn't tunnels under McMartin. The primary defendants, there were 7 defendants, but the primary ones were Ray Bucky, Virginia McMartin, and Peggy McMartin Bucky. Virginia was obviously an old woman. I think she's in her 80s at this time. Ray Bucky, I think, took the brunt of it because he was a male, and people, I think, were suspicious of a young male working in a preschool at that time. It didn't seem like he had any particular love of the job. I think it was a time in his life where I think he had dropped out of college, and he was simply working with his family. Peggy was his mother. Virginia was his grandmother, and he had come back home, and he was helping them out. They investigated him. They raided his home and everything, and they found the entirety of the evidence against him was he had this kind of scofflaw mentality that had him not wearing underwear under his pants, they found. And he had pornography in his home, which was actually a few issues of Playboy. And none of these things were terribly abnormal, but they thought they really had him there. Oh, they did find a black robe, I believe. It turned out to be his graduation gown, but that didn't make much difference to the prosecution. The interview tactics were called into question, and this is another thing. These are indicative of the entire interviews. These aren't like you go through and you say, aha, this was bad interview tactic. This was kind of how the interviews were performed. They would question these kids endlessly until they would get the answers they wanted. They were going forward with this idea that we must believe the children. In fact, this movement was created around McMartin called Believe the Children. And what you find is that they didn't believe the children at all, so long as they were saying nothing happened. They were only believing them after they had finally beaten them into saying that something had taken place. And here's some of the clips from that. The interview says, oh, you're so smart. I knew you'd remember, reinforcing these ideas that certain recollections or certain claims are okay while others are not. So I bet if you guys put on your thinking caps, you can help remember it. Now let's test your brain and see how good your memories are. Can you remember the naked pictures? And the child says no. Can't remember that part? Shakes head no. Why don't you think about that for a while, okay? Your memory might come back to you. How about Naked Movie Star? You guys remember that game? Child, no. Everybody remembered that game. Let's see if we can figure it out. Kind of have the peer pressure thing going on through the whole interviews too, where they'll say, oh, all the other children remember this. Why don't you remember this? Aren't you smart like the other children? Were you ever afraid of Kelly? No. No? No. Would you tell me if you were afraid of her? Okay. You see the kids in this picture? Every single kid in this picture has come here and talked to us. Isn't that amazing? These kids came to visit and we found out they know a lot of yucky old secrets from that old school. They all came to us and told us the secrets, and they're helping us figure out the whole puzzle of what used to go on in that place. And they used puppets. The children were supposed to speak through puppets, and the idea was that the kids would speak more freely or speak past the blocking if they were speaking through the puppets. They also used the anatomically correct dolls, and I don't have video footage from the McMartin case, although I think some of it's in the HBO indictment, the actual footage from those interviews. But I was watching video footage from the Keller case, which is a similar case in Texas, and the people convicted there actually only got out a couple of years ago. But you had this therapist coming out with a doll that has a penis on it, and even pointing it out, saying, "Oh, what's this? What's this for?" And the kid is like, "There's a dick on this." And then they're like, "Well, the kid must have been molested. Look at the kid's concentrating on the dick. It's terrible." And the interviewer says, "No, I think this is another one of those tricky games. What do you think, Rags?" Talking through the doll. "Yep. Yes. Do you think some of that yucky touching happened, Rags, when she was tied up and couldn't get away? Do you think some of that touching, that Mr. Ray might have done some of that touching? Do you think that's possible? Where do you think he would have touched her? Can you use your pointer and show us where he would have touched her?" That's very leading. Here's an interesting little video clip that shows some of the thinking regarding child interviews at the time. And the first woman you'll see talking turns out to be Bryce Taylor's therapist, who Bryce Taylor was spending hours of therapy time with to reveal her memories of having been a CIA-controlled sex slave. Her name is Catherine Gould.
The third cluster of symptoms that the therapist needs to look at very closely is how the child feels about monsters, ghosts, witches, devils, Dracula, all this supernatural kind of thing. Again, there is a point in time when children do have nightmares that involve those kinds of supernatural entities, and normal ages for that are again around the age of 3. When you get to kids who are 4 and especially 5 on up, who are still having a lot of fears of ghosts and monsters and Draculas and that sort of thing, you want to be looking very closely at them. The child is really supposed to outgrow that. It's not supposed to be consumed with fears of supernatural entities. Children who've been ritually abused tend to think that there's a monster or a ghost living in their closet, that such an entity is going to come in through the window or the air vents and assault the child, that ghosts and monsters are sort of all around them and they're constantly being watched, harassed, or controlled in some way, or that the child has some supernatural entity of this kind actually inside of them.
And what about this monster?
That's Nightshade.
That's who?
Nightshade.
Nightshade. And where does Nightshade live?
Up right there.
Right there. And what does Nightshade do when
Dry this all up.
Okay, I'll dry this all up. What does Nightshade do when Nightshade comes out? Oh, he puts kids in the grinder.
And he gets in the wet.
And he gets in the pool. And what does he do in the pool?
He swims.
He swims. What else? Is Nightshade a he or a she monster?
He's a she monster.
A she monster. And what makes Nightshade come out? Oh, is that what Nightshade says? Yeah.
What makes Nightshade come out? Could Nightshade come and visit me now? Could she? What should I say to Nightshade so she will feel safe and come visit me? Could you say that again? Say it again. Say it again. I can't hear you.
Put these back.
Put these back. Was that Nightshade talking? It was. Hello, Nightshade. It's nice to meet you. Are you a monster? Are you a monster?
I'm a good guy.
You're a good guy? Oh, you're a
good girl.
You're a good girl. I'm sorry. You're 3. One of the primary defense mechanisms that we find in children who have been so severely traumatized as children who have been ritually abused is dissociation. And one of its most extreme manifestations is multiple personality disorder. What we see with this little girl is a clear-cut case of multiple personality disorder. She has between 6 and 8 clearly identified, different, sometimes identifiable by me, personalities that come and go, that can sometimes switch when we ask, but most often switch when certain kinds of outside things happen. Now this monster is a new personality that we've never met before. We often find that children have had monsters who have been programmed by cults in order to get a child to get an altar that will help them perpetrate, that will become cult identified. And even the good news is this little girl is telling me that this is a good monster, which makes me feel like this is a monster who doesn't want to perpetrate anymore, may not feel the need to perpetrate, and that may be why she came out at this time.
I don't think you necessarily need any exposition by me to note what bullshit that is. But that is real child abuse, and they were going through convincing these kids at McMartin. You know, I have 2 3-year-old kids. The onset of childhood amnesia hasn't even set in yet. You know, you might have people for life believing that they've actually been abused and cultivating those so-called memories of abuse that never happened, and buying into this bullshit paranoid theory of satanic cult abuse that never was. There was actually a piece in the Los Angeles Times in 2005 written by or told to a journalist by one of the kids from the McMartin preschool. He was a bit older, I think, than the other kids at the time, which probably explains why he was cognizant of what was going on at the time. And he felt that he wanted to apologize for his role in creating some of the child testimony evidence from the Children's Institute International. But he explained the process by which it came to that. And he was saying, the first time I went to CII, we drove there, our whole family. I remember waiting for hours while my brother and sisters were being interviewed. I don't remember how many days or if it was just one, but my memory tells me it was weeks. It seemed so long. It was an ordeal. I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to get out of here unless I tell them what they want to hear. Anytime I'd give them an answer they didn't like, they would ask again and encourage me to give them the answer they were looking for. It was really obvious what they wanted. I know the types of language they used on me, things like I was smart or I could help the other kids who were scared. And he ends by saying, I would love to look at the defendants from the McMartin preschool and tell them I'm sorry. But still to this day, people point to the evidence that Ted Gunderson came up with, that there actually were tunnels under McMartin, to say that obviously something bigger was going on and there was cover-up. And one of the most infuriating cases of that was recently, there's this book about satanic panic and pop culture paranoia in the 1980s, and it treats the satanic panic in its proper context as a moral panic, as something that wasn't rational. And yet it has this article in here by some asshole named Adrian Mock, I guess, and he's claiming that but the tunnels were there after all. And laugh as you will at the narratives attached to this, but there's something bigger going on, and speculates, of course, that Judy Johnson, that there may have been more to her death than we know, even though there wasn't much question in autopsy reports that she really did die of cirrhosis of the liver and she had serious alcohol problems. So there's still this idea, and this really I think prevented the hardcore conspiracy fringe from ever confronting what they had done in this idiotic mob mentality that they had constructed. And that was due to Gunderson, because he came in and he was looking for these tunnels. And when you look it up online, you can look up tunnels of McMartin, and you're likely to see pictures of large brick-lined tunnels underground, big chambers or whatever else. None of those are what Gunderson claimed to have found. He went, had the concrete on the floor opened up, which it's hard to explain how they would have, I don't know if they were supposed to have sealed over the concrete, but he was saying that the tunnels had been filled in at some point after the accusations had come about, and that they were sneaking in debris and dirt and had filled in these holes. So Gunderson came in and he hired an archaeologist from UCLA, and he claimed to be digging out what was filled in, and claiming that there was differences in the soil, there was debris that proved that this was opened up into a tunnel area, and that they were opening tunnels that had been filled in but were pre-existing before. This is where the McMartin preschool was. There was, previous to that, the plot used to be owned by, I think, a couple different families, but there was a house that was demolished around 1975. That's the approximate location of the garage, outer yard play area for McMartin. But this is where the tunnels are claimed to have been found. The importance of where the previous house was comes when other experts analyzed this and looked at the evidence and looked at the debris that Gunderson, the archaeologist, came up with, and they were saying, well, this, all the debris dated from 1920 to around 1950. There wasn't trash pickup in this area at that time, and it was common practice for people to bury their trash, or to bury trash with combustibles, sometimes burn it, and then eventually seal over the pit, and then start one next to where it was previously, often creating a line of where this trash was. And that fit with the dating of the debris. They were saying, of course, the question was, is if the teachers and the defendants in the McMartin preschool trial were actually filling in these tunnels, what are the odds that they would find only debris dating from this time period, and what are the odds that they would also have brought with them one of the mailboxes of one of the former residents of the house? So it was very clear that these were trash pits previously, and that they were simply wrong about them being tunnels. There's the one piece of evidence Gunderson really hung on to was there was apparently a bag from Disney that dated like 1982 that was there. But this being the outlier piece of evidence, some experts suggested, and it was very shallow where that was at. They were saying that this was most likely attributed to rodent, squirrel, burrowing animal of some type, and that kind of thing happens all the time. Much less likely, given the preponderance of evidence of the rest of the debris, that it was actually there at the time. I guess, according to Gunderson, I haven't seen it from Lanning himself, but there was a satanic panic debunking FBI agent, the last name of Lanning, who, according to Gunderson, accused Gunderson of actually having planted that bag himself. I wouldn't find that unlikely either. Now, here, though, is Gunderson talking about excavating the McMartin tunnels and talking about the archaeologist signing off on this idea that they had found the tunnels. Because usually when they refer to the tunnels, they speak of this expert from UCLA, unimpeachable credentials, this archaeologist who said there were tunnels and that they had been filled in. But I think this little segment from Gunderson is pretty revealing.
Well, I'll tell you what. In the spring of 1993, I heard that the property of the McMartin School had been sold from the McMartin family to the defense attorney, actually given to him. He said he was broke and he sold it to a contractor. The contractor was going to build an office building on the space. And I heard that the contractor had this property. And so I went out and contacted him. And I said, dear sir, I would like to have access to that property. He said, I'll give you 2 weeks. I signed a contract, assumed liability, and along with some of the parents, we hired an archaeologist from UCLA, Dr. Gary Stickle, knowing full well that I'm not qualified to say there's tunnels under there, even if I found them. And we began our dig. At the end of 2 weeks, I had to stall, because Dr. Stickle was not quite ready to admit there were tunnels. It took us 34 days. At noon the 34th day, with the bulldozers, with their motors running, ready to knock the building down, he was going to knock the building down and then build this office building. Dr. Stickle said, you know, I can say without any question right now, there have been tunnels under the school. They were filled in. The tunnels were 30 inches wide, 44 to 46 inches deep, with the top of the tunnel 30 inches under the classroom floor. The children were able to walk through it. We're talking about young kids now, right? The adults had to stoop down and walk through it, but they could do it. We found a 9-foot wide subterranean entrance under the west wall of dog room. There were 4 classrooms. That was Ray Bucky's room. By the way, Virginia McMartin and Ray Bucky were tried. Virginia, the grandmother, was acquitted. Ray had a hung jury. And we found these tunnels in the middle of the second trial of Ray Bucky. They could have been used to convict him. We called the prosecutor. He sent his investigator out, Mr. Perez. Mr. Perez told me, I don't want you entering in my conversation with the archaeologist. I said, why? He says, you're too argumentative. And I said, well, okay, you go in and talk. I'll just keep my mouth shut. We went in, he talked, and he argued with the archaeologist. Here's an investigator not qualified to talk about tunnels. He said, there aren't any tunnels there, and the archaeologist, of course, argued. But anyway, they didn't use that evidence, strong evidence, in the second trial. They ignored it, right in the middle of the second trial. I might mention this. The children identified professional football players, professional baseball players, household name actors, actresses, and the son of the leading politician, not a leading politician, the leading politician in Los Angeles as being perpetrators.
So he talks about these Hollywood stars and these athletes. What's hilarious about that is when they were interviewing the children, they were showing the children pictures of the suspects and saying, who did what? You know, can you point out? And they would be pictures of the defendants from the McMartin case. The defense attorney thought, well, I'm going to put this to the test. So he took characters like Chuck Norris, who was one of the ones eventually fingered by the children, and put them in a list of pictures, people he felt nobody could say these kids had had any contact with. And the kids were saying, like, oh, yeah, him, and pointing out Chuck Norris. And to the defense, he thought, well, I've established that they're just pointing to people and saying they did it because they're being shown a series of pictures of people. Well, to Ted Gunderson, that meant that guys like Chuck Norris were, in fact, involved and that the children had been flown over during the day when they were supposed to be in class and molested by I don't know if you consider him an A-list celebrity or not, but guys like Chuck Norris. So they found animal bones too in the holes. You'll notice he said those tunnels were 30 inches wide. And now, can you imagine ritual sacrifices going on down there, or Virginia McMartin, the older, overweight woman, actually making her way through those tunnels to do any of those types of things? I mean, the story falls apart just based on his description of the tunnels alone. Ted Gunderson, under testimony, he dampens his claims against Satanists a little bit. I thought this was kind of funny. They were questioning him about the McMartin case, and they were saying, well, they were going through a trapdoor through the tunnels and all that, and they were taken out of that trapdoor and whisked away in cars to people who were pedophiles. Gunderson had to come up with a story about them flying in jets and being, driven places because you had to connect them to these celebrities and these other people in far-off locations. He said, right, for prostitution, the question, and including people who are involved in satanic cults. As far as I know, I can't say because I don't know who the cult members were who may have had sex with them. I don't know, but I'm sure there were Satanists in there someplace. And you might wonder what kind of trial this came from. Well, Ted Gunderson was acting as an expert witness, and funny, he thought the interview tactics of the children in the McMartin case were unimpeachable, but when his friend and webmaster in 2008 was accused of indecent activity with children, Gunderson claimed that this was absolutely absurd and the government was out to frame him up and that these children were made to say these things. This is Christopher Link Jones, the friend of Ted Gunderson, who was on the sex offender registry for lewd and lascivious acts with a child under 14 years of age. And under further questioning, they interrogate him, and they said, even though the interviews indicate that the children reported acts in a sexual nature against Mr. Jones here before they were interviewed by the detective, you still are sitting here saying that you're up here testifying because you don't believe in the case? And Gunderson said, I don't think that sex entered in this case from what I reviewed. Okay, adult male taking pictures of naked children with their cell phone, is that sexual in nature? Depends on the purpose of taking the pictures. Adult male showing pornographic materials 9-year-olds, that's appropriate? Answer, it's my understanding that was not possible because you're talking about the Playboys, or are you talking about the internet? Well, I'm talking about the interview which occurred, correct? The children talked about being shown pornography, correct? Well, they talk about pornography on the internet. I mean on the television. So, I mean, all this talk about calling bullshit on these types of stories and it being the side of defenders against child abuse, against the other, it doesn't quite shake out in reality. The most disturbing part of this is how it ties in today and how, the Satanic Panic is kind of formally dated to have ended around 1995, and that's when it kind of lost mainstream acceptance. But you still have these people operating like Catherine Gould and people who buy into the Bryce Taylor story, as ridiculous as it is, and they're acting as licensed mental health professionals. And you can see from this collection, I put together Bryce Taylor talking only at this one conference, how instrumental her therapy was in developing her delusions.
I was attending Pepperdine University working on my degree in psychology, and I attended an international psych conference where Catherine Gould, who, as many of you know, was a therapist who's worked with ritual abuse, DID patients for a very long time. And I went to one of her lectures, and I remember walking out of her workshop thinking, boy, I sure hope I don't get any cases like that when I'm a therapist. And that was the end of it for about 3 years. I kept praying for God to please help me and help me decide what was wrong and why I felt so unhappy even though I had everything. The answer to that prayer came in the form of a kind of a massive wake-up call. My head went through the windshield of the automobile. What began to emerge were memories of being sexually abused. And then came memories of ritual abuse. And I was in therapy increasing amounts of time. I went to get in my car and I opened my wallet and I looked inside and there was a $1 bill that had programming numbers. And I had uncovered enough of my own programming to know that what this meant was it was another threat, only this accident I didn't believe was to be an accident. I believed that they were threatening to kill me, because it didn't really make any sense until I was able later to really put together the larger picture of what this whole New World Order agenda was. And then with that, it started to make sense. So anyway, Ted Gunderson and Catherine Gould kept giving me security tips, and I was running from place to place, trying to stay alive and sleeping on the floors. One perspective I would like to share with you is that I believe that mind control is one of the major secret weapons of those people bringing in the New World Order. When Reagan was president, I was prostituted to him and Kelly was prostituted to the vice president. I was involved in a lot of parapsychology and psychic research and remote viewing and telepathic communication studies and experiments. A lot of this New World agenda is fueled by the secret societies, and the ones that I was abused by were the Shriners, and also the Masonic Order people, what they participate in as a seal of their oath of secrecy is often satanic ritual. And I was working towards my master's degree to be a clinical psychologist. I was in a therapy group here for people that had multiple personality disorder. I'm also a member of the ISSD, which is the Study of Dissociation group. Normally, the groups that I speak to are mental health professionals, and so we're kind of on the same page, and I really know exactly what they're going to need to hear in order to help the victims and survivors that they're working with.
So she usually speaks at conference of mental health professionals, and herself being a symbol of perfect mental health herself is able to speak up on these issues. She was saying that she's a member of the ISSTD, and the ISSTD is in full operation today. In fact, last year, some contingent of people from the Satanic Temple, our Grey faction, were protesting at their last conference because we don't think people are aware enough of the damage they do and the way they can, their tactics, their debunked tactics can cause people to live with this sense of crippling paranoia. And it's very disturbing to think of people in a state of emotional and mental distress going to a paranoiac who's feeding them these delusions that can stick with them for the rest of their lives. The International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, it's mostly respectable in people's minds. If you look it up on the website, they bury a lot of this kind of material, and they kind of step away from direct reference to satanic cults, ritual abuse, and mind control. But it is there on their website still. They have ritual abuse, mind control, special interest group. In the packets you have that I gave with you, there's a petition we had put out against somebody who helped run their ritual abuse, mind control, special interest group up until we put out that petition, and then they scrubbed her name from the website. I feel like within days of us putting up that petition, her name was Ellen Lachter, and she was being consulted by a woman who felt that her 8-year-old kid didn't actually have autism. He was autistic, but that he was exhibiting signs of having been abused by a satanic cult, and she ultimately murdered her own child, feeling that she was preserving him from a lifetime of abuse. Anyways, her name is Ellen Lachter, and much like Bryce Taylor, she talks about Illuminati conspiracies and satanic ritual abuse and that kind of thing, and we contended that if the mother of this child had taken her child to somebody who would not have helped cultivate these beliefs in her, maybe the outcome would have been different. And maybe the licensing board should start taking the licenses away from these people who hold these severe delusional beliefs. And you can see on the very last page, we ultimately got a letter back from the state of California that said, we reviewed your complaint, and we closed the case because we did our due diligence, and there's nothing wrong here. The fucking letter's not even signed. It's really insulting. Of course, we're going to follow up on that. Bryce Taylor had spoken before amongst a whole plethora of other people who believe in these tales at a conference called Stop Mind Control and Ritual Abuse Today. That's the tortured acronym for SMART. Ritualabuse.us is its page. They do annual conferences. I went to one, I think it was 2010, and they were literally selling electromagnetic beam blocking hats, which I called like a higher evolution of the tinfoil hat. They were selling at a vendor booth, and the the guy who runs these conferences, he's also a licensed mental health professional by the name of Neil Brick. And he believes that he was a mind-controlled Illuminati assassin and that he lived this kind of born identity life where he was going on secret missions and murdering other agents in Eastern Europe and these other tales. And you can get continuing education units for going to these kinds of conferences. I was at this conference, and there was a woman about 40 years old, said that she had been personally a slave to the Nazi Dr. Joseph Mengele, and that he was using abortion somehow to reinforce mind control. She was from some church, and she was very anti-abortion, and that was the whole idea, was that abortion was evil. But she was also saying that at the time, Dr. Joseph Mengele was working on some kind of demonic resonance project to open up portals into other worlds and other things like that. And that was when I was really thinking about how it was really something to think that somebody could get continuing education units to hear that shit. It said something about the whole field, I thought. Neil Brick also runs an organization called Survivorship, and they helpfully put a calendar up every year of significant dates in which Satanists and other groups are likely to act. And if you're a victim, you need to be on your guard. I only put the month of March because that's where we're at right now, and you'll see like almost every day has something for you. I mean, beware of St. Patrick's Day. I think even Canada Day has something somewhere on the calendar. Not in March, but you know, the calendar's pretty full, so you pretty much have to stay in your basement, your lead-lined basement, if you want to be safe from anything at all. We sent a couple people from Gray Faction to the last survivorship conference, and here was a little clip they took of Neil Brick talking when he was getting very upset by people touching their faces. He didn't want anybody to touch their face because it could be triggering. Now here's a man who claims that he was used as an Illuminati assassin, so who knows what triggering could mean to him. He might wig out and kill somebody, but here he is talking about it.
The first speaker, my name is Neil Brick. I'm a survivor of ritual abuse and mind control. I continue to educate the public about child abuse, trauma, and ritual abuse crime. Safety things. You know, one big thing is try not to go to your face at all. Brush your hair, touch your glasses, anything. Those can be construed as triggers every year. Not every year, but a lot of times we have trouble with those things. If you have an itchy face, sit on your hands. We'll be coming up to you and telling you not to do those things politely, and if you keep doing them, we'll have to ask you to leave. And we don't want to do that, so try to sit on your hands. Okay. A lot of accessing methods, obviously visual ones are big. I mean, I see people with itchy faces here going to their faces a lot even now, even after what I said. If anyone else goes to their face, I know what it's going to have to ask you to leave now. So this is the last moment. Ask it over.
So this is what Gray Faction fights against. This is that's what Gray Faction is about. We are in ripe conditions, I feel right now, for a new satanic panic. Thank you. It's on change.org. The link is at the top of the petition's in the pack if you've got one of them, and there's a link at the top. Yeah, I think it's definitely worth letting people know about. I think it's really an under-recognized atrocity. After the Salem witch trials, there were at least apologies within 10 years. One of the judges came forward and said that they had done some awful things. no such apologies came from the satanic panic of the 1980s and 1990s. And it's really sad and disgusting to see the same people getting away with it every day. But the fact that these people can operate on this level and actually are teaching people these conspiracy theories and calling it psychology, I think is horrific. And it's a problem with the APA. The APA has lost a lot of credibility, I think, within the last edition of the DSM. A lot of people are very critical about a lot of the diagnoses that were thrown in, and we can see that a lot of it's just not based on science at all. This kind of paranoia, this kind of crippling paranoia that ruins people's lives, is very much transmissible. You know, it's a social disease, and it's something that I feel that, you know, when you have people like this populating rape crisis centers, and I found that to be the case in, I think it was Virginia. If you look up dolphin porn, along with whatever else comes up, you'll find an article written by me where I had written a letter to a university where their sexual abuse crisis management was being run by a woman who had close ties with Smart and Bryce Taylor. They never replied to my complaints either, but I thought that was just a horrifying prospect that somebody of that age being traumatized by abuse could then go in to get help from somebody who might tell them, well, you know, there's a lot more to it than that. If we dig deeper, you might realize that there's a, you know, everybody's out to get you, and you've been molested many more times than you possibly even imagined. Yeah, a lot of pop culture and film really has an influence, and I think some of it is also atavistic. I was doing a lecture one time, and when people came in, I asked them to write down like the top 5 most depraved activities they felt a group of people could be involved in, and they were all very much consistent. And you know, cannibalism, incest, you know, murder, scatophilia, or scatophagia, or whatever else. You know, often urination, shitting, cannibalism. Just there's a limited menu in people's minds of what are the most depraved things, and that's rather cross-cultural too as well. It's very much deep within. People like Catherine Gould or some of these other therapists, they would claim that the uniformity of these claims kind of proved that they were true. If all these people are claiming that cannibalism occurred, there must be something to it. But when you're regressing people and asking them to remember what happened to them, and it's implicit that what happened to them must have been absolutely horrible, and at the hands of a group of people, these themes are going to recur. But you do see that pop cultural references are very prominent as well. And that was an interesting part of the Bryce Taylor news clip, where they were saying her story was very similar to some film that I wasn't aware of with Gina Davis. I'm not sure if it's actually been confirmed or not that Bryce Taylor actually had this car accident, or maybe she was inspired by seeing the movie. I have noticed that a lot. When I was at the SMART conference, I saw a woman who was giving a lecture, and she had claimed that she had been tortured for years at a military base by a group of high-ranking government Satanists and prostituted, the whole kind of Bryce Taylor story. But what was really bizarre about her lecture was she was talking about very mundane things. She was saying that her father was a strict disciplinarian. She wasn't talking about her recovered memory. She was supposedly talking about what was supposed to be her real life. And I thought that these were probably accurate recollections then. But she was saying that he would get pissed off and he would make the children stand, or the child, I don't know if she was an only child, he drew a spot on the wall, and she'd have to put her nose to it until he said she could, you know, she was calmed down enough or whatever that she could go about her business. And I thought, why is she talking about these things when she's, you know, supposedly believes in this Illuminati conspiracy or whatever? That seems just too mundane, but I didn't doubt it at all. And then I was going through transcripts of previous lectures that were given at the SMART conferences, and I saw that story again, and I thought, well, maybe she just tells that story every time she appears. But I realized the story was being told by somebody else, but that she was attending at that time. And I thought, well, maybe there's that cross-contamination then. Why why was that significant enough to tell to begin with? But then that one person had told it, she was there, and then told it thereafter. I think there's a high level of suggestibility within that community. Yeah. I think there was I think it was there's a great retro piece. New York Times has started doing these like 15-minute video pieces where they're retro montages of older stories. And one of the ones they did, it was on McMartin. And I'm not sure if it was on that one or not, but there was a follow-up on some of the children. And a lot of these children were too young to, people just don't accurately remember when they were 2 or 3 years old. And, there was that one child, I said he was older. I know he was older, the one who eventually apologized, and he knew they were making it up when they were doing the interviews. But sadly, he did say that he found that the McMartin kids were normal and seemed well adjusted. But a lot of them, though they didn't have direct memories of being abused, they were still convinced abuse must have happened. I feel that does give you some kind of distorted perspective on your worldview if you're still going to believe in this conspiracy, and if you're maybe invested in it because you'd rather believe that than that everybody around you was an idiot.
I was wondering in your research at Ted Gunderson if you ever got more information about the beauty and art bell, those they had.
Some of that's hilarious. I've got all these great transcripts from Gunderson, and I decided to do this lecture, and then I started going through the FBI file again and going through these transcripts, and I didn't have time to read through it all again, so I just I pulled a lot of things at random, like I said, with the Bryce Taylor quotes and things like that. And I was looking through some of the transcripts and writings with the Art Bell fiasco, and it wasn't really significant to the story to me, but it was just funny. Just the accusations going back and everything else. But something that was really bizarre was that cross-examination where he's acting as an expert character witness in defense of his webmaster, Christopher Link Jones, who was accused of lewd acts with children. When the Arizona chapter comes here, the Satanic Temple Arizona chapter is coming here. They don't know it yet, but we're going to film reenactments of some of these transcripts. And they'll probably find it out watching this. And something we wanted to do with Gray Faction as well is take a lot of these transcripts of some of these therapists brought under cross-examination and reenact them because they are so ludicrous. Neil Brick? Yeah. No, somebody else filed a complaint against him, but they disregarded it, and they had some other therapist, David Poles was his name, and he decided that he answered the wrong question, and I felt it was the height of irresponsibility. Neil Brick was claiming that he had multiple personality disorder, and he had multiple personality disorder because the Illuminati, CIA, Satanic conspiracy had abused him at an early age to turn him into a secret special agent so he could go out and commit these crimes or these missions for them or whatever else. And yet this guy examining Neil Brick said he doesn't seem to have any substance abuse problems anymore, and he doesn't exhibit signs of multiple personality disorder anymore, so therefore he's clean. It didn't call into question at all these beliefs. And I think part of the problem is people are very touchy on questioning somebody's beliefs, but at what point is it within the purview of somebody working in the mental health field to say there is something that's objectively reality and something that's not? I think when you're in the field of mental health, that's something you absolutely must do. I don't know. I mean, that's something we've been working on for some time now. Before DSM-5 came out, I tried propagating. There was a petition put forward by professionals to get dissociative identity disorder consigned to one of the appendixes, at least, to say that it's kind of speculative, experimental, not fully proven, or whatever else. And that didn't happen. And I think that's kind of tragic, because by now we see that the idea of multiple personality disorder to these people means that everything else they're saying in relation to it is also true. Like I said, that if you question Ted Gunderson's bullshit, you're inevitably going to get people that saying that you're questioning the existence of child abuse. I don't really know. I mean, that's a big question on a lot of diagnoses. They found that, that after television special came out about somebody, some high-profile celebrity having anorexia diagnoses spiked. So it's hard to know sometimes with mental disorders at what point people are being given a framework to express whatever melees they have, and it doesn't really make it any less real. But the idea with dissociative identity disorder is that it is very much iatrogenic, meaning that it's clinically imposed, that you don't generally have multiple personality disorder unless it's being cultivated by a therapist. And if you kind of think of this idea of somebody having multiple names, having different personalities of different names, that takes cultivation from somebody on the outside. I mean, at what point are you going to say your name is something other than what everybody else is calling you? I can't imagine walking around one day, and people, calling me by my name and me saying like, well, no, I feel like I'm Bill. It just doesn't work that way. That takes a certain type of interaction. And I feel like, multiple personality is very much one of those things where it's imposed by this kind of therapeutic practice, but sadly it doesn't make it less real for the people who have it. And that's what makes the therapy itself abuse. And that's corroborated for me by people who are called retractors. I've talked to many people who, when I started writing about these things, when I wrote about the SMART conference and things like that, people who went through the therapy were convinced that they had multiple personality disorder, convinced that they were abused by cults or whatever. They come out from their inpatient program, they get off the drugs or whatever, they look for the corroborating evidence, they find that it was all bullshit. They also feel that then that they had this diagnosis imposed upon them and the multiple personality imposed upon them. But the memories, the false memories, even if they know them to be false, are still very troubling to them and give them nightmares. And there again, if you're using alien abduction as a case of that, if we all agree that alien abduction probably didn't occur, if you feel like they might, they might be onto something, that I don't really have an argument. But there was a woman I was speaking with, she went by the pseudonym of Emma Woods, and she had been going through this regressive therapy to recall being abducted by aliens by one of the prominent investigators of alien abduction named David Jacobs. And she very much realized that these were not true memories, but they still very much troubled her. And it's a terrible thing. No, I don't have anything accurate on that. I only know that I read fairly consistently about people coming up for parole again, or people coming up on appeal. Like I said, the Keller case, they just got out of prison not too long ago. But there are new cases still. I mean, that's the horrifying part. If you look up the Moeller case, Moheler, that was just within these past 10 years, and that was in Missouri. And the daughters in this family were going to some kind of pet psychic or something like that, and they decided they had been abused. And the sheriff's department came, dug up the whole farm, and the costs of having to defend themselves against this lost them their property, lost them just about everything, and there was nothing to the claims at all. But they're ruined. They're ruined thereafter. Another case within modern times here, after the turn of the century, was the Castlewood Eating Disorders Clinic in St. Louis. In Castlewood, they were running this system where whoever was running the program felt that this anorexia, bulimia, whatever the eating disorder was indicative of being abused by the satanic ritual abuse or whatever else. 4 women sued, saying that they had been treated they had been treated improperly, that they were imposed with these false memories of ritual abuse and that type of thing. But as happens so often in these cases, and since I started looking into this, I see that it happens I knew it would happen. I talked to the lawyer. He told me he would do his best to make sure it didn't happen, but did anyway. I guess I can't blame him. But the Castlewood offered a settlement to the women rather than them prosecute. And as part of that settlement, they're not allowed to talk about their experience. And so the perpetrators in this case go off and go into private practice or whatever else. The institution will get rid of them. They'll go off and they'll do something else, and they'll still be working. I mean, it's kind of like the Catholic Church. They just shuffle around elsewhere. The institution themselves kind of want to get rid of them, move them off somewhere else, and that's all that comes of it. Thank you.